My name is Eric Kimberling. I'm the CEO and founder of Third Stage Consulting Group. We're an independent digital transformation and ERP consulting provider. And I wanted to chat today about the Capital One and Equifax cybersecurity breaches. Capital One, as you may have heard, was recently hacked and exposed to, I believe it was 106 million customer profiles or data points were stolen from an internal or by an internal employee or a former employee of Capital One. And then Equifax had a similar breach a couple of years ago, which has resulted in them spending billions of dollars and just tightening up the security of their systems and their whole IT infrastructure. And before I dive into the nuances of what this means for cloud ERP and people that are thinking about migrating to the cloud, I wanted to share a little bit about what my experience has been with speaking with CIOs who are thinking about moving to the cloud and what some of the perceived advantages are and what some of the perceived risks are. And for years now, especially if we look back about 5 years ago, probably the biggest risk that CIOs saw, or the biggest fear that CIOs had, was that if they moved to the cloud, they wouldn't be able to control their data and they wouldn't feel comfortable having the data, their master data, transactional data, all that stuff housed outside the four walls of their internal IT department. And I always thought, in my mind, well, that's not, it's reality because it's perception, but the reality is that typically these large cloud hosting providers are going to be better at providing world-class cybersecurity and keeping hackers out and that sort of thing than the average internal IT department. But now you hear these stories about Capital One, for example, which is a massive company that was hosting their systems on Amazon Web Services. You hear about these big companies being hacked into, and it makes you wonder, what does that mean for the average mid-sized company or small company or even a larger company that doesn't have nearly the resources as Capital One? And same with Equifax too. It's a very large organization that has run into trouble. So, in the past, I've always tried to temper CIO's fear about having their data hosted in the cloud, but these sort of breaches make it difficult to temper those fears. And more recently, the bigger concern with cloud has been the maturity of cloud functionality in terms of, you look at SAP and Oracle and Microsoft Dynamics, and how mature is their cloud product versus the old legacy on-premise products. That's been the bigger concerns for a lot of CIOs lately, but now it kind of causes us to rewind the game film and go back in time now and start to worry again about the fundamental cybersecurity aspect of cloud ERP. And so you add to this the fact that ERP vendors are headed to the cloud, whether you like it or not. That's where the ERP vendors are headed. Some of them have already mandated that legacy customers switch over. Some of them have already started to push that way. Some of them are doubling down on the R&D investments in cloud and pulling resources away from on-prem solutions. So you can kind of feel the tide shifting. The tipping point has been reached, and now at some point in the near future, whether you like it or not, or agree with cloud or not, most resources and most organizations at some point will probably be in a cloud system. So begs the question, what do we do? We've got these security breaches and concerns that we have as CIOs. So what does that mean for our organizations? And so I wanted to share just a few thoughts and lessons as it relates to this sort of challenge. So the first thing is that when you look at the I believe it's the Equifax breach, and I've got a few of the articles that a colleague printed out for me and clipped out in some cases from recent press on this. But when you look at the Capital One situation, that was an internal employee a former employee that took the data with her, and she's been arrested. And I think there's a trial waiting or a hearing for that. And I think they exposed, or they found out about the breach via some of the ethical hacking or their own internal testing, stress testing, whatever you want to call it, of the system to identify potential breaches or loopholes. And that's how they found that this data had been stolen. And so it really begs the question or raises the issue that your internal resources are likely to be just as much of a risk as outside hackers. So we always hear about the outside hackers because it's a lot more dramatic. And when it's a big company like Equifax or Capital One or whoever, you're going to hear about those breaches. And a lot of times that does involve a hacker. But what flies under the radar that we don't hear about as often are the times where employees are taking stuff from us, or former employees, as in the case of Capital One. So internal breaches are the one of the biggest risks. So it's partly a technical issue as far as tightening up the security and making sure people have the right security profiles so that they can't access data they shouldn't have access to in the first place. So it's part technical, it's part functional, and it's also part organizational change management, just training people on the need for security and making sure everyone's on the same page and you have internal alignment around making sure you've got the right cybersecurity mechanisms and controls in place. Another question that comes up as a result of these recent cybersecurity threats is who owns your data. When you're talking about cloud ERP, the data is not within your four walls, but who owns it and who's responsible for making sure that the data is protected. And at the end of the day, it's you, the organization, that owns the data and the customer data, master data, and all that stuff. And chances are, if something goes wrong or there's some sort of regulatory violation or as a result of a security breach, I would think it's probably going to be more on you than your cloud hosting provider or your cloud ERP vendor, whatever the case may be. Now, granted, I'm sure there's some culpability there with the vendors as well, but chances are, that it's ultimately going to fall on you in some way. So it's important to recognize that you own your data and you're the one that has to be responsible for ensuring that your internal resources and external threats are being addressed, regardless of what cloud hosting provider you do or don't choose, or what cloud ERP provider that you do or don't choose. Another factor here is that organizational change management is the culprit of many of these security issues. And one of the articles that was about Equifax actually was talking about Equifax. This is in the Wall Street Journal, by the way, from just a few days ago. It was talking about how Equifax had, since the breach that they had a couple of years ago, they've spent $1.4 billion on recovering from the cyber attack. And they have another $1.2 billion planned for additional IT and cybersecurity to protect their data. And one of the things they mention in here that now that they're 2 years post-hack and post-security breach, one of the things they're saying is that there's been a lot of lengthy, expensive work to overcome entrenched behavior that made it vulnerable in the first place. So I suspect they're probably talking about their IT department, and maybe there's some, I don't know if there were philosophical lines in the sand around what they did or didn't do from a technological perspective. But whatever the case may be, it's clear that we need to make sure that we're managing change and that we're helping our IT department and the business users and people that also have an indirect impact on the safety of our data and proprietary information. We want to make sure that we are bringing them along and we have clear alignment on what those expectations are, so that we can ultimately better safeguard our data from a change management perspective. And as I mentioned before, security is your responsibility, not just your cloud provider. So on one hand, you own the data as well. So I mentioned earlier that you own the data, but you also own the responsibility for making sure that you've got security in place. If you don't like the security controls or measures that your cloud ERP provider provides, then switch providers or do something about it. Or if you're hosting your ERP system in the cloud somewhere and you have essentially an on-prem version of the software that you're hosting through Amazon or some other web hosting provider, you want to make sure that you have the right hosting provider, you feel comfortable with the controls that are in place, and that you're doing your own trust but verify sort of testing, ethical hacking, if you will, of the technology to make sure that you're comfortable with those controls and measures that have been put in place. So just to recap here, cloud is where ERP vendors are headed. So get used to it. I mean, that's just a kind of the lay of the land now, unless something dramatic changes or there's some sort of big backlash as a result of these sort of security breaches, or people aren't comfortable with the mandates to switch to the cloud and there's some sort of backlash there. Barring anything dramatic like that, I think that we're still headed toward the cloud. And whether we like it or not, that's where the vendors are spending their money, because that's where they make more money, and the economic machine is driving that transition largely to the cloud. The second thing is to ensure that you do your job to maintain the security of your ERP system. It's your job to find the right ERP system, implement it in a way that is going to protect and safeguard the data. And one of the keys to getting there is ensuring you have the right change management in place and that behaviors are changing along with the technical infrastructure components of cybersecurity. So I hope this video was helpful. If you have questions, feel free to reach out to me. I've included my contact information here on this slide. You can also reach me via the link that I have down below in the description field of this video on YouTube. And I've also included a link to one of our recent articles about things to think about as it relates to switching over to cloud ERP. So I encourage you to check out that article as well via the link in the description field below. And while you're at it, if you wouldn't mind also subscribing to my YouTube channel, you'll get notified every time we put out new content like this. So I hope you found this content useful and hope you have a great day. Take care.